Hello everyone. Before we get started, I'd like to ask for your thoughts. What do you want to see in the stories? What themes, characters, or plots really interest you? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Your input is important to us and we want to make the videos even more interesting for you. Thank you so much for your support, and let's get started. Halloween had never been a big deal for me, at least not since I was a kid. It was the one night of the year when my street, usually deserted by dark, came alive with parents trailing their little ghosts and goblins, the echo of laughter carrying from house to house. But my participation these days was minimal: a pumpkin on the porch, a bowl of candy, and an evening inside watching reruns of some old show. This year was supposed to be no different. I'd settled in on the couch, my feet propped up, phone within reach, the TV volume low enough to hear the doorbell but loud enough to drown out the wind rattling through the trees outside. The occasional burst of laughter from kids on the street, or the crunch of leaves under little feet drifted through my open window. There was a comfort in it. I could practically predict the evening down to the minute and hour of steady trick-or-treaters, tapering off until maybe 8 or 9, and then nothing but quiet. The first few kids came right on cue, little clusters of princesses, superheroes, and zombies. I offered up candy with a laugh, admiring their costumes, playing my part. They'd take a handful, beam up at me, and scamper back to their parents, who nodded politely from the sidewalk. It was around 8 when things started to die down. I just settled back onto the couch, letting myself sink into the cushions. The show had barely resumed when the doorbell rang again. Strange at this hour, it was usually older kids, too old to be wearing costumes but not quite willing to let the tradition go. Maybe I'd have to be a bit stingy with the candy to stretch out the last few pieces. I opened the door, expecting to see a group of teenagers. Instead, there was only one. He was maybe 17 or 18, tall but narrow-shouldered, with the build of someone who hadn't quite grown into himself yet. His costume or lack thereof caught me off guard. No face paint, no mask. Just a plain black hoodie, jeans, and a backpack slung over one shoulder. A small, inscrutable smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. I hesitated. "Hey there. Trick or treat?" He gave a slow nod. "Yeah, trick or treat." His voice was low, almost monotone. "Guess you're going for the minimalist approach." I tried to joke, holding out the bowl of candy. He reached in, took a single piece of small, wrapped chocolate and examined it, turning it over in his hand like it was something foreign. I waited for him to leave, but he didn't. He just looked up at me, meeting my eyes. His gaze was unsettling, too steady, lingering a beat too long. My discomfort grew as he stood there, holding the chocolate, his hand still poised over the candy bowl. "So, have a good night," I prompted, nodding toward the sidewalk. He didn't move, just kept looking at me. Finally, he slid the chocolate into his pocket, gave a slight tilt of his head, and turned to leave. His movements were measured, deliberate, as if every step required careful thought. I closed the door and locked it. For some reason, I felt an odd relief as soon as the latch clicked. Something about him had rubbed me the wrong way, a vague sense of, what? Wrongness? No, it was subtler than that. But it stuck with me, even as I tried to settle back into my show. A few minutes passed before the doorbell rang again. I nearly ignored it, thinking maybe it was just one of the neighbor kids making a last-minute round. But curiosity tugged at me, and I made my way to the door. Peeking through the peephole, my stomach twisted. It was him again, standing there, the same slight smile on his face, hands stuffed into his hoodie pockets. I opened the door just a crack this time. "Can I help you?" His smile grew a fraction wider, and he pulled a hand out of his pocket, holding up the same piece of chocolate. He held it out to me as if he were offering it back. "Sorry," he said. "I think this one's yours." I stared at him, my mind fumbling for a response. You already took it. It's fine." But he didn't lower his hand. He just stood there, the small candy resting in his open palm, waiting. Unsettled, I reached out and took it from him. The wrapper felt strange, damp against my fingers, like he'd been holding it for a long time. "Thanks, I guess," I muttered, unsure of what else to say. He lingered for a moment longer, then gave a short, slow nod and walked back down the path, disappearing into the night. My pulse was elevated as I shut the door. I knew it was stupid to feel uneasy. It was just some kid messing around, probably bored and trying to get a rise out of me. But there was something off about him, something I couldn't quite shake. I went back to the couch, feeling my comfort erode as I replayed the scene in my head. Another half hour passed. I had almost convinced myself to let it go, to chalk it up to Halloween weirdness, when the doorbell rang again. My stomach clenched. This time I approached the door more cautiously, my hand hovering over the lock. Through the peephole I saw him again, standing alone, perfectly still, watching the door as if he knew I was looking right back at him. Taking a deep breath, I cracked the door open just a couple of inches. What is it this time? He tilted his head, the same small, humorless smile playing at his lips. Trick or treat, he said quietly, almost like a whisper. My patience wore thin. Look, I don't know what game you're playing, but maybe it's time to call it a night, yeah? You're a little old for trick-or-treating, aren't you? His expression didn't change. He took a step closer, so close that the door was all that separated us. I caught a faint scent, something metallic like rusted iron hanging in the air between us. Am I? He asked softly. A chill ran down my spine, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. I didn't respond, didn't move. I just stood there, holding my breath as his gaze bore into mine. His eyes were a pale, unsettling shade, like a storm cloud about to break, and they locked onto mine with a focus that felt unnatural. Finally, he leaned in, so close I could feel his breath through the crack in the door. You know, he murmured, I don't think you understand the rules. I swallowed, my mouth dry. What rules? For a moment, his face held an expression almost disappointed, like he'd expected something more from me. Then he turned, leaving without another word. I shut the door, my hands shaking, and threw the deadbolt. Every instinct in my body told me that whatever was happening, it wasn't innocent. I forced myself to sit back down, clenching my hands to steady them. The room felt colder, the shadows darker. I tried to focus on the TV, to let the familiar sounds drown out my unease. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, lurking just out of sight, watching. An hour passed, then 2. Midnight approached, and I had just started to relax when there was a soft, rhythmic tapping on the window. My breath hitched, my pulse thundering in my ears. I glanced over, my heart sinking as I saw his face, pressed against the glass, his eyes trained on me with a look that bordered on fascination. I stood, moving slowly, not wanting to startle him. What do you want? My voice sounded weak, trembling. He didn't answer. He just watched me, that eerie smile curling his lips. And then, as if reading my thoughts, he lifted his hand, pressed it flat against the glass. His fingers were long, pale, with dirt caked under his nails like he'd been digging in the earth. Last chance, he whispered, his voice muffled through the glass. I stepped back, my body rigid with fear, and he pulled away from the window, fading into the darkness without another word. I waited, standing in silence, listening for any sign that he'd come back. But there was nothing, only the wind outside and the ticking of the clock on the wall. I didn't sleep that night. I kept every light on, flinching at every creak, every shadow. Even as dawn broke, washing the room in pale light, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, somewhere, watching, waiting for me to understand the rules. The night of Halloween hung in the air like a shroud, thick and suffocating. It was the perfect night for ghost stories and graveyard visits, but Jay and I had something else in mind: the old Black Hollow Tunnel, an abandoned relic of our town's forgotten history. They said it was haunted by the souls of those who had vanished within its depths, never to return. Are you ready for this? Jay asked, excitement mingling with anxiety in his voice. I wasn't sure if it was bravado or true confidence. Either way, I nodded, trying to ignore the knot of dread twisting in my stomach. The entrance loomed before us, a jagged maw gaping into the earth. The air was colder here, as if the tunnel exhaled an icy breath. I hesitated, scanning the darkness beyond the threshold. You know this place is supposed to be haunted, right? Just a bunch of stories, he scoffed, but I could see his resolve wavering as shadows danced along the edges of his flashlight beam. We stepped inside, the light flickering against the damp stone walls, illuminating patches of moss and decay. The air was thick with the smell of mold and something else, something sweet, almost sickly. It felt like stepping into a tomb. Let's go deeper, Jay urged, pushing forward. As we ventured further, the walls closed in, the tunnel winding like a serpent. With every step, the echoes of our footsteps seemed to distort, twisting into something unrecognizable, as if we weren't alone. I thought I heard whispers skirting around the edges of our conversation, but I chalked it up to my imagination playing tricks. Nate, did you hear that? Jay whispered, his voice barely above a breath. I paused, straining to listen. There was a soft murmur, a voice threading through the silence. It sounded like someone beckoning, but the words were indistinct, warped by the tunnel's oppressive atmosphere. Maybe it's just the wind, I suggested, though even I didn't believe it. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the darkness became. Shadows flickered at the edges of our flashlights, shifting and sliding just out of sight. I felt a cold sweat beat at my forehead, but Jay pressed on, his eagerness igniting my own curiosity and fear. "Look at this," he said, shining his light on a wall covered in strange carvings, symbols etched into the stone like claw marks. "What do you think it means?" I shuddered, stepping back. "It looks like..." Suddenly, a loud crash echoed behind us, followed by a chorus of whispers rising to a crescendo. My heart raced as I turned to see the entrance engulfed in darkness, our path to safety vanishing. The whispers morphed into mocking laughter, chilling and taunting, wrapping around us like a noose. "Jay, we need to go," I shouted, panic surging through me. But Jay was frozen, staring into the shadows. "Did you see that he breathed?" What I asked, glancing over my shoulder. There, at the edge of the light, a figure emerged, a silhouette, tall and indistinct, shrouded in darkness. It stood unnaturally still, watching us. I couldn't see a face, just a void where one should be. "Run," I yelled, and we bolted, the tunnel seeming to stretch endlessly before us. My breath came in ragged gasps as we sprinted, the laughter echoing behind us, mocking our fear. We dashed deeper into the tunnel, desperate for a way out, but the walls felt like they were closing in. The whispers grew louder, swirling around us, weaving a tapestry of dread. "Nate." "Jay," they echoed our names, twisting them into something sinister, but Jay stumbled, catching himself just before he fell. "It's too dark. I can't see." I turned back, trying to gauge the distance to the figure, but the shadows were too deep. "Just keep moving. We're almost there," I lied, pushing him forward. Then I felt it cold breath against the back of my neck. The figure had moved closer, its presence almost tangible. I turned and caught a glimpse of something, a face, if it could be called that. It was a distorted mask of flesh, hollowed eyes staring, filled with an emptiness that pulled at my soul. "No," I screamed, pushing Jay ahead of me. We ran as if our lives depended on it, because they did. But the tunnel twisted and turned, and every corner felt like a trap. The whispers morphed into screams, echoing our fear, and I could feel the figure gaining on us. My heart thundered in my chest as I glanced back, just once. It was right behind us, its mouth stretching into a wide grin, filled with jagged teeth. "Stay with me," it hissed, its voice like gravel crunching underfoot. I could almost see the darkness spilling from its lips, a swirling mass that threatened to consume us whole. "Keep going," I shouted, shoving Jay forward as we stumbled toward the faint light at the end of the tunnel. The exit seemed so close yet so impossibly far. I could feel the darkness wrapping around us, almost suffocating. My chest tightened, and I could barely breathe. Just a few more steps and we'd be free. With a final burst of adrenaline, we hurtled through the opening, bursting into the cold night air. The laughter faded behind us, echoing one last time before it vanished into the stillness of the woods. We collapsed on the forest floor, gasping, the moon casting a pale light over us. I glanced back, heart pounding. The tunnel stood silent, a gaping mouth ready to swallow the next curious souls. "What the hell just happened?" Jay gasped, his face pale. "I don't know," I whispered, shaking. "But we can't come back here. Ever." The woods felt alive, as if the trees were watching, waiting for us to turn back. I didn't dare look at the tunnel again. Something had followed us out, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next Halloween night. That night, as I lay in bed, every creak of the house made my heart race. I could still hear the whispers, echoing through my mind, that sinister laughter lingering in the back of my thoughts. I knew that whatever had haunted those walls was still there, biding its time, waiting for the moment we'd be foolish enough to return. And somewhere deep in the dark, I could almost feel it grinning, knowing that the fear would never truly leave us. Halloween had always felt like a quiet, cozy time for me. I wasn't one for wild parties or big crowds. For me, it was all about staying home, handing out candy, watching old horror movies, and soaking in the atmosphere. But this year, Halloween fell on a weeknight, and rain drizzled outside, thinning the trick or treaters to a sparse few. I settled into my favorite armchair, hot chocolate in hand, with a bowl of candy at my side. An old black and white horror film flickered on the screen, its eerie score mixing with the sound of raindrops tapping against the windows. The night felt almost tranquil. Time passed slowly, and after an hour with no visitors, I thought perhaps Halloween would glide by without much fuss. Then the doorbell rang. I got up, candy bowl in hand, and opened the door, expecting a gaggle of kids. Instead, there stood a lone figure, a boy, perhaps a teenager, dressed in a long black cloak with a hood pulled low over his face. He looked older than the usual trick-or-treaters, maybe around 17. Shadows obscured his features, but I could make out his pale skin, the faint shimmer of bright blue eyes peering out from beneath the hood. "Trick or treat," he said, his voice flat, as though he'd rehearsed the line. I held out the bowl, trying to shake off a sudden feeling of unease. Sure, here you go." He reached out slowly, almost mechanically, and took a single piece of candy. Instead of leaving, he simply stood there, staring at me, his gaze unblinking, studying me as if trying to memorize every detail of my face. "Enjoy your night," I said, forcing a smile. I closed the door, shaking off the discomfort he'd stirred within me. But I couldn't settle back into my movie. I felt a growing tension, the silence of the house becoming oppressive. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like footsteps, every gust of wind rattled the windows. Just when I thought I could relax again, the doorbell rang. My heart raced. I opened the door, and there he was once more, standing in the same spot, cloaked in shadows. His head tilted slightly, and his eyes bore into me with an unsettling intensity. "Another one," I managed to say, trying to maintain my composure. "I just wanted another one," he said, his voice low, tinged with an edge that made my skin crawl. Sure," I replied, handing him another piece. He examined it with the same slow scrutiny, then slipped it into his pocket. He lingered, still staring at me, as if waiting for something. "Okay, well, have a good night," I stammered, hoping he would take the hint and leave. He nodded, almost reluctantly, and turned to walk away, his movements oddly stiff. I watched him go, shivers running down my spine. There was something about the way he looked back over his shoulder, his eyes glinting in the dim porch light, that left me feeling unsettled. The night dragged on. I tried to focus on the movie, but every sound outside seemed amplified. Every flicker of the screen casting shadows that danced ominously across the walls. I felt trapped in a cage of my own making. After what felt like hours, I finally relaxed, convinced he wouldn't return. Then came the third knock, harder, more insistent. I hesitated, the dread pooling in my stomach. Was it him again? I looked through the peephole, my heart racing. There he stood, closer to the door, his face now illuminated by the street lamp. His eyes glinted, almost feral, as if he were savoring my fear. "What do you want?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just want to see you again," he replied, his tone unsettlingly calm, almost affectionate. Panic surged within me. "Why?" "Because you opened the door," he said, his voice low and deliberate. My heart pounded in my chest. I backed away from the door, fear coiling tight in my gut. I was about to call the police when he spoke again, his voice softer, almost sweet. "You know, I'm not like the others." "Just go away," I pleaded, backing further away, looking for a place to hide. "I can make it better for you," he continued, his voice now slithering through the door. "Just let me in." "Get away from here," I shouted, but the words felt weak, lost in the suffocating atmosphere of the house. I pressed my back against the wall, looking for a place to escape, but there was nowhere to go. I felt cornered. After a long moment, the silence shattered when he suddenly began to knock again. But it wasn't just a knock, it was a rhythm, like a drumbeat in the night, the sound echoing in my head. "Let me in," he said, the calm in his voice now twisted into something more sinister. "Or I'll have to come in myself." His words hung in the air like a dark omen. My breath quickened, and I sank to the floor, trying to ignore the sensation of him lurking on the other side of the door. "I know you're there," he called softly, waiting. "But you're not safe. Not unless you let me in." A chill ran through me, freezing my blood. "Leave me alone," I cried, but even I could hear the desperation in my voice. In that moment, the door rattled violently, as if he were trying to force his way in. My heart raced. What did he want? I couldn't even think straight. "Let me see your face," he said, and I felt his breath against the door, cool and damp. "Go away," I screamed, feeling the tears prick at my eyes. Silence followed, thick and heavy, and I dared to believe maybe he had gone. But just as I began to relax, I heard a soft knock, more like a tap, tapping against the window. I turned slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. There he was, standing outside, illuminated by the streetlight. His eyes glimmered with a chilling hunger, waiting for my response, anticipation stretching between us. "Are you ready?" he whispered, a grin slowly spreading across his face, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too eager. I could only stare, frozen in place, feeling the walls of my home close and around me. The door was no longer just wood and metal. It had transformed into a barrier between my reality and the terror waiting just beyond. As he reached for the door handle, I felt a jolt of panic. What would happen if he got inside? I had to do something. I couldn't just stand there. But even as I gathered my courage, I knew deep down that I was already trapped in his game. I clocked in just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the faint glow of twilight giving way to a pitch-black sky. Halloween had always been a busy night for the convenience store, but this year felt different. The air was thick with anticipation, a buzz that vibrated in my chest as I settled into my shift. The fluorescent lights flickered above, their hum mingling with the distant sound of cars racing by outside. The store was familiar, a second home of sorts, with its aisles stocked with candy, chips, and sodas. It felt strangely comforting, the routine of scanning items and ringing up customers. Yet, as the clock ticked toward midnight, an unease settled in my stomach like a stone. I could already feel the weight of isolation creeping in, a familiar sensation during these long shifts, amplified tonight by the holiday. I leaned against the register, the bright screen casting a blue light across my face. The aisles were empty, save for a few hastily discarded costumes and decorations. A couple of kids had come in earlier, their faces painted like ghouls and vampires, squealing with delight as they raced through the store. Their laughter had been infectious, but it felt like a lifetime ago. Now all that remained was the unsettling quiet. The first customer of the night arrived just after 10, an older man with a scruffy beard and a faded flannel shirt. He shuffled down the aisle, his gaze fixed on the candy display, as if searching for something elusive. I offered a friendly nod, but he didn't respond, only continued to linger, examining the wrappers with a frown. After what felt like an eternity, he finally approached the register with a single bag of gummy worms. "Just these," he said, his voice gravelly. "Great choice," I replied, forcing a smile. I scanned the bag, the beeping of the register sounding loud in the stillness. "That'll be $2.99, he paid with crumpled bills, his eyes darting around the store, as if he were afraid of being seen. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about him. As he walked out, he cast one last glance over his shoulder, a shiver racing down my spine. A minute stretched into hours, each tick of the clock echoing in my mind. I was lost in thought when the phone rang. I jumped, startled by the sudden intrusion. I answered it on the second ring, expecting a customer's inquiry about the store's hours, or a complaint about something. But all I heard was silence, a deep, unsettling silence that stretched on. I cleared my throat, waiting for a response, but the line was dead. I hung up, a chill crawling up my back. Maybe it was a prank. I shook it off, forcing myself to focus on the flickering lights above me. The sound of the refrigeration units hummed softly, a rhythmic background noise that should have been soothing but instead only amplified my anxiety. It was as if the store itself were alive, breathing, waiting for something to happen. As the clock neared midnight, the atmosphere thickened with a palpable tension. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally in the dim light, and the sound of the wind outside howled against the glass. I wiped my hands on my apron, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. That's when I noticed that the stockroom door at the back of the store stood ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning me. I hadn't left it open, and the manager had made it clear that no one was allowed back there during the night shift. I walked over cautiously, peering inside. The air was stale, filled with the faint scent of cardboard and something else, something rotten. My heart raced as I took a step back, the door creaking ominously. I chalked it up to a draft, convincing myself that it was just the wind. Moments later, another customer walked in. At first glance, I thought he was just another late-night patron, but something felt off. He was tall and gaunt, his clothes hanging loosely on his frame, eyes wide and darting around the store. He moved erratically, picking up items at random and putting them back, as if lost in some trance. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He turned to me, and I was struck by the vacant look in his eyes, as if he were staring right through me. "Where are the masks?" he asked, his voice low and shaky. I pointed to the Halloween aisle, a little unnerved by his presence. He moved toward it, still glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to follow him. I tried to focus on the register, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that hung in the air. The man rummaged through the masks, holding them up one by one, a flicker of something fear or madness dancing in his eyes. "Do you think they'll see me?" he muttered to himself, his gaze darting around the store. "Do you think they'll know?" I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. It depends on the mask, I guess I stammered, unsure of how to respond. Suddenly, he dropped the mask he was holding and began pacing the aisle, mumbling incoherently. I felt my pulse quicken as he glanced back at me, his expression shifting from confusion to something darker. "They're coming for me." "Aren't they?" he whispered, more to himself than to me. "Sir, are you okay?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He stepped closer to the register, his movements jerky and erratic. "You have to help me," he pleaded, eyes wild. "They want me to." Before he could finish, the lights flickered again, plunging the store into momentary darkness. I felt the air grow colder, a wave of fear washing over me. When the lights returned, the man had vanished. My heart raced as I scanned the store, the aisles stretching ominously in the dim light. "Hello," I called out, but my voice sounded hollow, swallowed by the silence. I stood frozen for a moment, adrenaline coursing through me. That's when the phone rang again, slicing through the silence. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to ignore it. But curiosity got the better of me, and I picked up the receiver. "Hello," I said, my voice trembling. Silence. Then, a voice broke through, low and distorted. "He's here with you." My blood ran cold. "Who?" I stammered. "You have to get out," the voice urged. "He's not who he seems." The line went dead, and I slammed the receiver down, panic rising in my chest. I looked around the store, my heart thundering in my ears. I needed to leave. I grabbed my phone, ready to call for help, but as I reached for it, I heard a soft rustling sound from the stockroom again. Without thinking, I backed away from the register, my eyes fixed on the darkened doorway. The shadows shifted, and I swore I saw a figure move within. I turned to run, but then the front door swung open with a loud bang, making me jump. It was the man again, but this time he was different, his expression blank, almost mechanical. He stepped inside, and the moment he crossed the threshold, the lights flickered once more, casting eerie shadows across his face. "Help me," he said, but the words came out hollow, void of any real emotion. "Stay back," I shouted, raising my phone as if it were a weapon. He paused, tilting his head slightly, and I realized with a jolt that I was no longer sure who he was. Was he a victim or something far more sinister? The air thickened with tension, and I felt the walls closing in around me. "Please," he said again, his voice echoing eerily in the empty store. "You have to understand." I took a step back, my mind racing. The previous customer, the strange phone call, everything was spiraling out of control. As I fumbled for the door behind me, the flickering lights above surged and then went out completely, plunging the store into darkness. Panic set in. I scrambled toward the exit, my heart racing. Just as I reached for the door handle, a cold hand grabbed my wrist. I spun around, ready to fight, but it was the man, his grip surprisingly strong. "Don't," he hissed, urgency in his voice. "You'll make it worse." I felt a surge of adrenaline, my body screaming for escape. "What do you mean?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "They're coming," he whispered, eyes wide with terror. "If you open that door, they'll get you too." And then I heard the low hum of voices, echoing from outside the store. My heart raced as I looked back at him, searching for answers in his frantic gaze. "Who's coming?" I pressed, but he didn't answer. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder, panic etched across his face. "We need to hide." In that moment, I made a choice. I pulled my wrist free from his grip and sprinted toward the stockroom, heart pounding. If there was any chance of finding a way out, it had to be through there. The darkness swallowed me, the air thick with tension and fear. As I turned the corner, I stumbled upon a row of shelves stacked high with boxes. I crouched down, pressing myself against the cold concrete floor, praying that I could remain hidden. I could hear the soft thuds of footsteps approaching, voices murmuring just beyond the door. I held my breath, straining to listen, every muscle in my body tense. "They must be in here," one voice said, low and menacing. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the mounting dread. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me, a suffocating anxiety that threatened to swallow me whole. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, silence fell. I waited, heart hammering, hoping against hope that they had left. But then I heard the door creak open, a shadow spilling into the stockroom. "Where are you?" the voice called, echoing in the darkness. "We just want to talk." I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was as if time stood still, the world around me fading into nothingness. I could feel the fear clawing at my insides, and just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, the lights flickered back on. There they stood, two figures, their faces obscured by masks, a twisted smile curling on their lips. I was trapped. As I crouched behind the shelves, heart pounding, I weighed my options. The masks they wore twisted their features, and their laughter hung in the air like a taunt. I knew I had to act quickly. I couldn't let them corner me. With a surge of adrenaline, I pushed myself against the wall, trying to remain as quiet as possible. Their footsteps echoed as they moved through the stockroom, searching for me. My mind raced. I needed a plan. Then, I spotted a small window above the shelves, just wide enough for me to squeeze through. It was a long shot, but it was my only chance. I took a deep breath, preparing myself for the climb. The laughter faded momentarily as one of them exclaimed, "They have to be here somewhere." Their urgency gave me hope. Perhaps I still had time. I quietly moved toward the window, keeping my body low and silent. Just as I began to climb, I heard one of them say, "Check the back." They can't hide forever. Panic surged through me. I hurriedly pushed my body up, stretching toward the window. I was almost there when I heard footsteps rushing back, the sound of heavy boots pounding against the concrete. There, in the back, one of them shouted. My heart sank. They were closing in fast. With one final effort, I heaved myself up, feeling the cool metal of the window frame press against my palms. I scrambled through, half falling onto the ground outside. The cool night air hit my face, sharp and invigorating. I looked back just in time to see the stockroom door fly open, and the figures rush out, their eyes scanning the area. Panic surged through me again, but I forced myself to run. I sprinted around the side of the building, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I reached my car, fumbling with my keys in the dark. The sound of their laughter echoed behind me, chilling me to the bone. I finally got the door open, scrambling inside and locking it with shaking hands. I glanced in the rearview mirror, heart pounding as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, but I didn't look back. I tore out of the parking lot, the lights of the convenience store fading behind me. A nightmare I hoped I would never revisit. As I drove into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something far worse than just a bad Halloween prank. The thought haunted me. How many people had come in and out of that store, oblivious to the dangers lurking in the shadows? And as I turned down the road, I swore I could still hear their laughter echoing in my ears. A haunting reminder that sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones that blend seamlessly into the ordinary. Some memories fade with time, but others linger, haunting the edges of your mind, refusing to let you go. One of my earliest and most vivid memories is of a Halloween night when I was 9, the year I went trick-or-treating with my older brother and his friends. I had no real costume, just a torn garbage bag tied around my shoulders and some faded white face paint my mom found in a drawer. She smeared it over my cheeks and added a few smudges under my eyes, transforming me into a sad, scrappy skeleton. I looked ridiculous, but none of that mattered. All I wanted was the thrill of being out in the dark, under the dim glow of streetlights, like a real trick-or-treater. My brother, 13 at the time, reluctantly allowed me to tag along with him and his friends. They didn't want me there, but I kept to myself, trying my best not to slow them down. The neighborhood was alive with kids in colorful costumes, their laughter echoing down the street. Yet there was something about that night that felt off. I remember the sky was clouded, and the air carried an eerie chill, though it wasn't that cold. The trees swayed, casting strange shadows across the sidewalks, and a dense fog crept low across the ground, making every corner seem just a little darker, a little deeper than usual. As we moved from house to house, our bags filling with candy, I felt myself relax. The thrill of Halloween took over, drowning out that nagging sense of dread. House by house, porch by porch, the night passed in a blur of laughter and treats. But near the end of the street, we came to a house that didn't look quite like the others. The house sat a little further back, almost hidden by twisted, overgrown bushes that leaned over the cracked pathway. Its windows were dark, save for a single flickering porch light that cast strange, shifting shadows across the yard. Something about it felt wrong, like the house was holding its breath, waiting. My brother and his friends didn't seem to notice, already walking up the path, laughing and joking as if it were just another house. But I hesitated, feeling a chill creep up my spine. The front door opened before we even knocked, creaking slowly to reveal a tall, thin man. He wore a dark coat that reached his knees and a hat that cast his face in shadow, hiding his features. I could just make out his eyes, small and dark, glinting with a strange, intense curiosity. He didn't say a word, only nodded at my brother and his friends, dropping candy into their bags. but when he reached me, he paused. He leaned down, bringing his face close to mine, so close I could smell his breath stale, with a faint, sour undertone. He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes narrowing, as if he were studying me. Then he reached into his coat and pulled something out, slipping it into my bag with deliberate care. "For you," he whispered, his voice barely more than a rasp, his words lingering in the air long after he'd straightened up and closed the door. My brother's friends moved on, oblivious, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the man's words were still echoing in my ears, following me as we left his house and made our way back down the street. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just some old guy playing a Halloween trick, but the unease stayed with me, heavy and unshakable. When we got home, I dumped my candy onto the kitchen table. As I sorted through the treats, something cold and rough slipped out of my bag, landing on the table with a soft thud. It was a small white doll handmade from rough, fraying cloth. Its button eyes were uneven, one stitched slightly higher than the other, and its mouth was a twisted red thread, giving it a distorted, unsettling smile. My stomach tightened as I picked it up, feeling the stiff fabric under my fingers. The doll was cold, unnaturally so, as if it had been left out in the rain and then frozen. I showed it to my mom, expecting her to laugh it off, maybe tell me it was just a toy. But her face went pale, and she grabbed it from my hand, her eyes wide with something I'd never seen before: fear. She demanded to know where I'd gotten it, and when I told her about the man and the way he'd whispered, her hand shook as she set the doll on the counter. "We're getting rid of this," she said, her voice shaking. I started to protest, curious about why it scared her so much, but she was firm, tossing it into the trash without another word. That night, she locked every window and door in the house, checking each lock twice, her movements quick and nervous. I didn't understand her fear, but it stuck with me, making the dark seem deeper, the shadows thicker. I tried to sleep, but I kept hearing that man's whisper "for you" over and over, until it felt like he was right outside my window waiting. The next morning, the doll was back. It was sitting on the kitchen table, right where I'd first seen it, its crooked smile somehow more twisted, its button eyes staring up at me with cold indifference. I called out to my mom, my voice shaking, and when she saw it, she froze. She grabbed it again, this time throwing it into the outside garbage bin, making sure to close the lid tight. But the next day, it was back on the table, waiting, as if it had never left. Days passed, each morning the same, waking up to find the doll sitting there, untouched, unchanged, its gaze fixed on me. My mom stopped talking about it, her face growing more drawn and pale with each day, but I knew she was scared. We both were. One night, just before Halloween, I heard something. A soft scraping sound, like fabric dragging across wood. I lay in bed, frozen, listening as the sound grew louder, closer, until it stopped right outside my door. I held my breath, my heart pounding, straining to hear, but there was only silence. Then, just as I began to relax, I heard it, a soft, faint whisper, echoing through the dark. "For you." The next morning, the doll was gone. We never found it, and my mom refused to speak about it again. But every Halloween since, I feel that same chill, that same sense of being watched. And sometimes late at night, I still hear that whisper, echoing from somewhere deep in the shadows, a voice I'll never forget. "For you."